One of the things that's very important to remember about the progressive era is that it wasn't limited by party. It wasn't just a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. There were progressive politicians on both sides of the aisle. There were Democrats and Republican progressives. Now, as I said previously, eventually you're going to see the progressives form their own party. And the next individual we're going to talk about had a lot to do with that. So we're going to talk right now for a little bit about a guy by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt has pluses and minuses just like any president would. There are those within the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. There are those Republicans who feel that Teddy Roosevelt was the greatest thing ever, and there are those who feel he was a national disgrace. And the same thing is felt by Democrats as well. So it really, you would have to argue that Teddy Roosevelt was his own person. He wasn't going to be bound by any kind of specific political party. Now, one of the more interesting aspects of Teddy Roosevelt, and a picture of him, there it goes, that's Teddy Roosevelt. He usually went by just the name being referred to as TR, okay? Now, Teddy Roosevelt is one of a number of politicians that had some fascinating little tidbit of them. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, as you take a look at him there, okay, you see the tie, okay, you see where the tie is and where the vest is buttoned and what have you. Believe it or not, underneath that shirt, Teddy Roosevelt had this tattooed across his chest. He is, I think, the only president that we have confirmation of as having a tattoo. And that's what he had there, was the crest, the family crest of the Roosevelt family. Basically says there at the bottom, something to the effect of, he who plants it will take care of it, or he who plants it will harvest it. So Teddy Roosevelt, very, very proud of his family name and whatnot, wanted something like this so that everybody would know just how proud he was. There aren't any real pictures of him with the tattoo, at least none that I've been able to find. There are some fakes on the internet, of course, but generally speaking, yeah, nothing that you could actually see. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, as I said, usually like to go by just TR, and a lot of times you're going to hear me, when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, I'm just going to say TR. We do have a chapter coming up on America's expansion onto the world stage before World War I, and Teddy Roosevelt is going to have a lot to do with that. He went by TR, but he also went by the nickname the Rough Rider, and this is in reference to the service he performed in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And we will talk more about that, but suffice to say, Teddy Roosevelt was really one of our more ambitious, energetic presidents. For example, I am a big fan of coffee. Teddy Roosevelt went through a minimum per day of 1 gallon of coffee. He was something of an adrenaline junkie. He enjoyed boxing. He enjoyed hunting, fishing, being out in the outdoors and things like that. So he was an individual that wasn't really just going to be confined to the White House. When he was president, he wasn't just going to be there running the country or anything like that. It was very important to him to be very active. You'll also find out during his tenure that really is when we started to see a lot in regards to the conservation movement. He wanted to make sure that different areas of the West, that the wildness of America would be preserved for all time so that people would be able to enjoy it. He was a huge outdoorsman, as I said, and he wanted other people to have the ability to go through and enjoy the outdoors the same way that he did. So you're going to see that Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to have a very adventurous presidency, I guess is the nicest way to phrase it. And he's going to really, go down in history as somebody who really, really left his mark on the American political scene. Now let's talk a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt's rise, how he came to power. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was born to a wealthy family. He did not come from humble beginnings. All right? His family was well off, but Teddy Roosevelt had some issues. He had some problems. In particular, he suffered quite badly from asthma. As a child, he was not very healthy, and he really kind of took it upon himself to sort of make himself healthy. And his theory was that being out in nature, camping, hunting, things like that, that would make him stronger, it would toughen him up, it would do away with the illness that was causing difficulties for him. And for Teddy Roosevelt, it worked quite well. He became an avid outdoorsman, as I've said previously. He enjoyed, physical activity, hard work, stuff like that. I mentioned before, while he was president, one of the things he enjoyed doing was boxing. Okay, so he is going to come from pretty well off but sickly beginnings to really become his own person. Now, TR became president in 1901. Now, he wasn't elected president. He had actually been elected vice president. And he was put there to kind of get him out of the way. See, he started off, he'd had a number of different jobs in the political realm. He had been part of the New York State Assembly. He had been the commissioner of the New York Police Department. And eventually he made it up to the position of governor of New York. Now, the problem, as some saw it, was that Teddy Roosevelt was honest. He didn't like the machines. He didn't like any kind of monopoly or trust that was actually going through and harming the people. So he was a problem to the bosses. Okay, the political bosses, they're still existing at this point in time. They're still running the various machines, as we've talked about before. Well, they're very concerned. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt was never supposed to be president. Okay, he was supposed to be put somewhere where he could do very little harm. Okay, to get rid of him, they decided to make him vice president. So he becomes the nominee under President McKinley to be vice president. Now, some folks thought this was fantastic because the vice presidency, especially at that time, was seen as really sort of being in a holding pattern. You weren't really doing much. You were there just in case the president died, but you had no real authority or power. So the bosses in New York thought this was fantastic. We can get rid of him. We'll put him somewhere harmless. We'll make him vice president of the United States, and he won't cause any grief for us ever again. But others pointed out that that was insane because now Teddy Roosevelt wasn't just governor of New York, but he was a single heartbeat away from being president of the United States. And they're going to find out that putting him in as vice president would come back to bite them. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was very bold. He was ambitious. He was very full of energy. He was in constant motion, for lack of a better term. This was a guy, like I said, went through over a gallon of coffee a day. And so he was really going to be constantly full of energy. Okay, he enjoyed the outdoors. He enjoyed sports. And so it wasn't just like, he wanted to watch people doing stuff. He wanted to be the person actually doing things. So he was going to go through and he was going to try and lead his own way. Now, at one point, Teddy Roosevelt had become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, he was in this position. This is the job that he had. So it's sort of like being a Deputy Cabinet Secretary. He went through and it made it up to that particular point when war broke out between the United States and Spain. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he gets in touch with an old friend of his, a guy by the name of Leonard Wood, and they go together and they create their own cavalry regiment. Okay, cavalry is the soldiers on horseback. And so as a result, they put that together. It's really going to be made up of a bunch of their friends and stuff like that. He's going to resign from his position as Deputy Secretary of the Navy, and he's going to lead this group, which came to be known as the Rough Riders, in combat in Cuba. He's going to be most famous for a charge up a place called San Juan Hill. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to make a name for himself. You think about it, if you are the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, there's not going to be a lot of people who instantly recognize that name or even instantly recognize the face if they saw it. Think about it right now. If you were to be asked, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy? I would have to look that up, okay? If you were to be asked who the Secretary of the Navy was, probably most people would have to look that up. So you have to take into account that his position as the Assistant Secretary was not a big name. But he and his unit became famous during the Spanish-American War. The Rough Riders is what they were called, and became literally a household name. Teddy Roosevelt was going to be famous as a result of this. And so that was part of the reason that the bosses in New York figured they could get rid of him to the vice presidency. That at least that way it was well known, he was popular, and he would get elected and be out of their hair. But William McKinley ends up being assassinated, unfortunately. And when he dies, Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Now, he was going to be the youngest president ever in the history of the United States. He's only 43 years old. Now, the Constitution requires that you be a minimum of 35 years old, but for the most part, most presidents that we know and understand today are far beyond that 35. As I record this in October of 2020, we have both the Republican and the Democratic candidates for president, President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, both are over 70. The most recent young quote-unquote president we had was going to be President John F. Kennedy. He was elected about 44, 45 years old. I forget the exact date. But Roosevelt is going to probably go down in history as the youngest. Okay, he wasn't the youngest elected, but he was the youngest ever sworn in. And the thing about TR is that his personality made him an extremely popular president. A lot of people really liked the way that Teddy Roosevelt went about the business of running the country. Now, he did say at one point essentially that as long as it wasn't specifically prohibited by the Constitution, he would do whatever he thought was best for the American people. There has long been that debate over, presidential authority, and Teddy Roosevelt was really willing to, push the envelope on that one. He had a very bold personality. He had a very bombastic personality. And as a result, a large proportion of the American public really, really came to like him as president. In fact, he's going to be there for 2 terms, and at one point he will even run for a 3rd term, which was unheard of. But we'll talk about that later. So Teddy Roosevelt is really, you can think of him as the father of the modern presidency, as the father of the presidency that you and I know and understand and are exposed to on a regular basis, okay? The modern presidency really came into existence here. Now, Teddy Roosevelt used to refer to the presidency as what he called a bully pulpit, meaning that as president, he could go through and he could get a lot of stuff done by basically speaking directly to the American people, telling the American people what he wanted to do and why, and therefore getting the American people on his side. If you're president and you've got a mandate from the people that a majority of the American people like you, like what you're doing, then your programs are going to be able to get through pretty easily. And that's what happened here. He used his popularity to get his various programs passed. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. So you can think about all those different things we spoke of previously, the different aspects of life that the progressives wanted to change. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was very much a part of that. Okay, he looked at what was happening in the United States, what was happening in the world around him. And there were different things that were going on, especially with business and labor issues, that he just felt were not right. He was against the idea of there being monopolies and trusts that could go through and really cause damage to the American people, that they could have a monopoly, that they would, essentially be able to charge whatever they felt like for whatever they felt like, and that the American people would be the ones to actually lose out as a direct result of that. And so the fact that the people loved him, that he was very, very popular, he was able to use that to go through and get programs passed. Now, he wanted the common people of the United States, the average individual, to receive what he referred to as a square deal. Now, a square deal by definition, if it was lowercase, just means a fair deal, essentially. That it's something that you're getting, that no corners have been cut, that everything is on the up and up, that everything is not just legal, but it's also ethical and things like that. He wanted the American people to receive a square deal. And that wasn't just talking about the way that government and the people interacted with one another, but it was also the way that people and various businesses interacted with one another. Remember, this is a point in time where there really weren't a lot of rights for workers. This was a point in time where if you're at work and you get a finger ripped off or something like that, well, you just got to find another job that you can do with only 4 fingers or 3 fingers, and a thumb. there weren't a lot of protections. There weren't a lot of consumer protections. This was the time of the snake oil salesman that I mentioned previously, where you would have people come through, they would sell, whatever, this tonic that would guarantee to cure everything from baldness to cancer. And by the time people found out that they had been swindled, that person was long gone. So Roosevelt wanted the people of the United States to have a square deal, both in regards to how their dealings, and interactions with the government went, but also how their interactions went with the various businesses. His square deal referred to a program of progressive reforms that we're going to talk about. There were a number of issues that came up during the course of President Roosevelt's administration that he really had to, as the saying goes, take the bull by the horns to try and fix things by repairing a problem that existed for the American people at that time. Generally speaking, his reforms came across as good, sensible, stuff like that. Most people were in favor of them. Not all people, obviously, but he's going to have a famous relative, about 30 years after this point in time, named Franklin Roosevelt, who's also going to push through a bunch of progressive reforms. But in all honesty, Teddy Roosevelt is one of the first truly progressive presidents. Okay, McKinley was not one of those. The president that he replaced was not a progressive. He was more of a, let's keep things the way they are at this point. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't that way. He wanted to go through and use the power that he had as president of the United States to essentially fix the issues that he saw in the nation, to make life better for the American people, to basically go through and change the world, at least as far as the average American was concerned.